Columbus chose to finance the conquest of the West Indies by selling Native American slaves. And he characterized it as his granjeria, or granary. In other words, it was the granary that was going to pay for the conquest, that is, Native American bodies. And Columbus himself sent at least 3,000 and possibly as many as 6,000 or more Native American slaves to Europe. This begins as early as 1493. On his return voyage, he takes about 24 Native Americans to Portugal and Spain. In the subsequent voyages, many, many more are sent, men and women. Now, he intends to sell them by the thousands, not only in Spain, but he mentions the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands off, the west coast of Africa, as well as in Portugal and Spain and elsewhere.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. In 1920, historian Carter G. Woodson said, quote, "One of the longest unwritten chapters in the history of the United States is that treating of the relations of the Negroes and the Indians," end quote. How and under what conditions did Native Americans and Africans come in contact with each other? How much intermarrying took place between the two groups? How did white supremacy shape those relations? That great libertarian Thomas Jefferson said of the Native Americans, quote, "We would never stop pursuing them with war while one remained on the face of the earth," end quote. How close did Jefferson and other Europeans come to realizing this objective? We'll explore these and other questions with Dr. Jack Forbes, author of Black Africans and Native Americans, Color, Race, and Caste in the Evolution of Red-Black Peoples, 1400s to 1865. Dr. Forbes is professor of anthropology and Native American studies at the University of California at Davis. He is co-founder of DQ University, a Native American university located in Northern California.
Well, I think the main point is to fill in a gap that has developed because of the suppression of knowledge of the interaction of black people and Native American people. In other words, it's to tell the story to the fullest extent possible of the interrelations between these two ethnic groups with both extremely rich heritages of culture and history.
Where were the Native American population during the time that you studied?
Well, during that time period, I think virtually all areas of the Americas and all of the islands virtually, including up to Greenland for the most part, were occupied by different native people. So the entire continent and virtually all of the islands were occupied. Southern Greenland was a possible exception. When the Norse Vikings reached southern Greenland in the about 900, say, give or take, they found the remains of human beings there, but they didn't actually meet people in southern Greenland for a while. But almost everywhere else, there were native people occupying fully the whole space.
Okay, now back to the cultural question. Not that comparison is necessary. How would you compare some of the Native American civilizations with European civilizations during this time?
Well, again, it's very hard to generalize, and one wants to be careful to specify that, you can't be an expert on all these different kind of cultures. Right. But nonetheless, the European population had been exposed to many, many more examples of imperialism in the period from, say, the Roman Empire on. And imperialism is I regard it as a disease. I call it the disease of cannibalism. Because in imperialism, people think that they have the right to consume not only the resources of other people, but their lives as well. And one of the characteristics of this kind of cannibalism, or I call it the wetiko psychosis, from a Cree Indian word meaning a cannibal disease. The wetiko disease, it's a psychological and cultural disease. One of the characteristics is that it brutalizes people, because as a part of imperialism, well, the thing that keeps empires going is that you have to terrorize the people you're going to control. I mean, you don't get to steal their resources just by asking. You've got to take it by force, and then you have to create a reign of terror in order to maintain that system. So people become brutalized as a part of that. And after you've gone through quite a few of them, then it becomes a part of your culture, and the disease takes you into its clutches, so that the Europeans, particularly by the 1400s and 1500s, the northern Europeans, had learned to become Romans. And they like to even call themselves Romans. The Germans. Meaning building an empire and ruling over others. In other words, if you read a lot of history in the past, you will find that the French are very proud of the French Empire. All the areas ruled by the French flag. The British are proud of the British Empire. The Italians want an empire. The Germans want their empire. The Russians want an empire. This is the way you make yourself into big shots, right? And people think you're powerful and you're successful. Is because you are messing with other people's lives, right? So the concept of doing evil becomes, instead of being evil, it becomes the ambition of your society to do that. And along with that, of course, is the economic motive, or what we might call greed, although it's done not only for economics, it's done also for other illusions of grandeur and that kind of thing, which are psychological. But the economic motive of getting other people's wealth is the real springboard. So, in other words, you have a people who are more greedy, they're more avaricious, and they have definite plans and schemes of building empires. And that makes them very different from most native people. Maybe not all, but from most.
Last night while talking to you, you mentioned one of the, I don't know if you use the term mistakes, that Native American used in dealing with Europeans was that Native American would say exactly what he meant. Would you deal with that, please?
Well, one of the characteristics, I think, of a lot of traditional peoples around the world is that honesty is highly valued. And this has certainly always been true among Native American people. And to have a face, as the Aztecs used to say, to have a face means to have a personality that is not changeable. In other words, you can be relied on. Your word is your bond. Now, in a world of hustlers,
I thought that was a European saying. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, actually, it is an old expression among a lot of peasant peoples, because peasant peoples used to have that kind of relationship when they traded with each other. Again, they didn't have to write it down, just like they didn't have to lock their front doors.
Okay.
So it's not just exclusively among native people, but it's the idea that you can be relied upon. But when you're wheeling and dealing as a hustler type, that is an imperialism, one of the things you have to do is to fool people, right? And so it becomes, perhaps honesty is a temporary, at least, disadvantage in dealing with imperialists, because they get to know what you are up to too quickly.
When and under what conditions did Native Americans and Africans first come into contact with each other?
Well, the first contacts are probably lost in the mists of time and perhaps never will be known completely. The first evidence of early contacts, of course, consists in archaeological remains in various parts of the Americas that suggests a contact with Africa. The most famous and persuasive of those archaeological remains are the famous Olmec heads from parts of Mexico. In my own research, not being an archaeologist and so on, I don't go into that very extensively, but I do comment on it. After that ancient period, we then get indications of Native Americans traveling or being driven by storms via the major ocean currents to the west coast of Europe and down as far as Spain and Portugal. This is as early as 60 BC, and then during the Middle Ages we get more references. And even Columbus met Native Americans in Galway Bay, Ireland in 1477. So there is a possibility that Native Americans by drift or other means also reached the Canary Islands and the west coast of Africa. But there's a great deal of research that remains to be done there, which at this point all I can say is it's a possibility. I'm convinced they did reach Europe, but whether it's farther south or not, I can't say for sure.
Okay, let me give you a quote from your book. You say, quote, "It will perhaps be surprising to some readers to learn that the greatest degree of intensive contact between Africans and Native Americans did not occur initially in either the Americas or Africa, but rather in Europe. Explain.
Well, this arises from the fact, principally from the fact that Christopher Columbus, above all else, was a slaver. And according to the Spanish Jesuit writer, not Jesuit writer, excuse me, but the Spanish writer Bartolomé de las Casas, who is the principal author of, that gives us the information from Columbus's diaries, Columbus chose to finance the conquest of the West Indies by selling Native American slaves. And he characterized it as his granjeria, or granary. In other words, it was the granary that was going to pay for the conquest, that is, Native American bodies. And Columbus himself sent at least 3,000 and possibly as many as 6,000 or more Native American slaves to Europe. This begins as early as 1493. On his return voyage, he takes about 24 Native Americans to Portugal and Spain. In the subsequent voyages, many, many more are sent, men and women. Now, he intends to sell them by the thousands, not only in Spain, but he mentions the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands off, the west coast of Africa, as well as in Portugal and Spain and elsewhere. So even before there are any appreciable number of African slaves being sent to the Americas, there are Native American slaves being sent to Europe, principally probably ending up in Lisbon and Seville, or Sevilla, in southern Spain, but also being transshipped to Valencia and many other cities. Now, at the same time that that's happening, there are large numbers of African slaves being sent northward to the same cities. And in fact, as far as black Africans are concerned, they've been being sent northward since approximately the 1440s, 1450s to those cities. There are also, I might add, large numbers of white and brown Muslim slaves from North Africa, and white and Asiatic slaves from the Baltic also being shipped in by the Turks and Venetians, principally. So that throughout this western Mediterranean area, you really have a cosmopolitan scene in these cities, and to some extent in the rural areas as well. So it's in these cities where large numbers of black Africans and substantial numbers of Native Americans meet, undoubtedly intermingle, and become part, eventually, of the urban populations of these cities and others.
Now, they were slaves. What were they doing? What tasks were they performing?
Well, that needs to be studied in greater detail. We do know that some were engaged in agricultural labor. We do know that some were apprenticed to craftspeople. And unlike the slavery that developed in the Americas, it was, at least in Spain, primarily a slavery where there would be very small numbers of slaves employed by a few individuals, not huge plantation-type slavery. So I would imagine that almost any type of craft you can think of, almost any type of job. In Lisbon, for instance, we know that the slaves were allowed to, in their spare time, sell water. And there were particular spots along the river in Lisbon where certain kinds of slaves were given the exclusive right to get water. For example, the Moorish slaves from North Africa had one section of the river, men. And then the Native Americans and Africans and females and males had other sections of the river that they could get water.
Were allocated to them?
That were allocated to them. And this was so that they could make a little extra money. They had the right to make money in their spare time. And they'd sell their water in different parts of Lisbon and do other odds and ends. They also, in Seville, they had a captain general who was in charge of the slaves and of the free people of color in Sevilla. He was an African of royal blood who was named the governor and captain general of, as they say, all the negros y loros in Sevilla, that is, of all the blacks and brown people in Sevilla. And they had their own rules over weddings and other kinds of things. So it's a little bit different from slavery as it develops in the United States.
Okay. Now, when people think of American slavery, they don't think of the enslavement of Native Americans. Why is this?
Well, partly because the enslavement of Native Americans occurred first, and
say that again, please. Say that again.
The enslavement of Native Americans really began before the enslavement of Africans, not only in the Caribbean by the Spanish, where it was extremely extensive. In the Caribbean, I might mention that the numbers were huge that were involved, and they had several kinds of slaves. They had the normal slave, but they also had people who were called, well, they were called Indians from the useless islands. They were from islands where there was no gold. And so they had the right to go and remove people from those islands.
The useless islands?
Yeah,
What
well, Jamaica, for example, would be a useless island because it had no gold. Inutiles, not useful. And they needed labor so badly on Haiti, where the gold was found, Haiti, and Cuba, that they were stealing people constantly and removing them by force from other islands. Even after it was no longer technically in the best or possible, legally even, to enslave, they still could remove them as forced free labor. We could call it later coolie labor, right? And then they had other categories of unfree Indians as well. But once the population declined on the islands themselves, they began raiding the north coast of Venezuela and Colombia very extensively, also part of Panama. They also came up here and cleaned out the Bahamas completely. All the Lucayo people.
What period are we talking about now?
Well, we're into the 1440s, the 1540s, 1560s. Many people from Florida, South Carolina is raided for slaves, and also the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. Many Mexican Indians are sold as slaves, and it extends on into a much later period of time. But in short, the tremendous numbers of Native Americans were enslaved, and the Spaniards kept looking farther and farther afield for slaves to replenish the labor supply. And part of that, of course, meant then that they turned to Africa. And particularly, well, in the early 1500s, they started bringing in a few African slaves, but they had some second thoughts because many of the Africans ran away and joined the native people. And there were major rebellions, particularly famous on the island of Haiti, led by an Indian chief named Enriquillo or Enriquez, who had Africans as well as Native Americans in his rebellion. There were a number of those. And so because of that, they held off for a little while. They thought the mixture was too dangerous. They were also very worried because some of the Africans, particularly from Senegal, were Muslims. And they didn't want Islam, they didn't want Judaism either, but they didn't want any foreign religion but Christianity spreading in the Americas. In any case, what happened was that about 1520, they began bringing in many more Africans again. So you get, again, the Native American being the first slaves in the region, and then African slaves coming in and supplementing their numbers.
You have said that one of the reasons that most of us don't think of Native Americans when we think of American slavery is that the enslavement of Native Americans was first, but are there other reasons?
Well, I've thought about it some. I don't know that I have a definitive answer, but I believe that one of the interesting things that happens with Native American people, especially in the 20th century, is that they are, by and large, forgotten about whenever the military battles are over. That is, the popular movies that have taken place and so on are almost always to do with the armed resistance of Native people to conquest, right? But you probably can't even think of a single movie where whatever happens to these Indian people after the battle is ever told about, right? So they might have a couple of guys shaking hands and saying, oh, sorry about the warfare, you know, it was due to a misunderstanding, you know, now we're going to live at peace together, chief, you know, and everything's going to be great. But you never see what happens after that. I think partly because it's very difficult for the white newcomers to North America, particularly, to face up to the fact that this isn't just a little romantic set of interludes between knights that are jousting with each other. This is a materialistic and economic war, not only a war for land, but a war for resources and a war for labor. And in many, many areas, Native Americans were reduced to poverty and forced to become workers and laborers on white people's ranches and so on, in addition to, in the earlier period, being enslaved. So that I think that the white population just wants to bury what they've done to the native people. They don't want to really know what they did and what they're still doing in some areas. I think that's one of the main factors. I think another factor, however, has to do with the overwhelming presence in later periods of time, particularly in the East Coast and the southern United States, of people of African descent. And the white population becoming preoccupied with its relations with the black population.
Okay. Could you talk about how Europeans went about capturing Native Americans?
Well, it's not a happy thing, but it illustrates one of the kinds of great lessons that we as human beings have to learn. And that lesson is to be very astute and not allow ourselves to be used against our brothers and sisters. Not allow ourselves to be dupes and to be used in brutal ways against other human beings. Okay, often we don't simply have the information, and the Spaniards were often very direct and very brutal. They just went in and captured thousands of people and rounded them up and took them to market. But in other cases, the colonialists were much more clever. For example, the Portuguese conquered Brazil basically by Portuguese men intermarrying with native people, particularly powerful tribes living along the coast, powerful chieftains. And then, of course, you know, Native Americans value their families very much. Kinship is extremely important. And so, without realizing it, now they've got a new member of the family. He doesn't have the same motives that they have, but there are kinship obligations by means of which this Portuguese guy gradually takes advantage of existing enmities that may exist between Indian groups, maybe some old hostilities, and uses then his relatives against other Indian groups. And pretty soon rewards them with guns and with other weapons and goods for capturing other human beings. And so it starts out small, but as time goes by, it becomes tremendously big operations. In southern Brazil, for example, in the 17th century, there's a period of time in which at least 200,000 or 300,000 Indian people from Spanish Jesuit missions in the Paraguay area are raided and carried off to the coast as slaves, largely by bands of people who are mixed Indian and Portuguese or Indian, but led by mixed blood or Portuguese chieftains who are the founders of Sao Paulo, or Paulistas, they're called in southern Brazil. Other colonialists, example in South Carolina, the English are very astute to also take advantage of existing animosities. And they get some of the tribes to provide a lot of the slaves, and by that mean they acquire, for example, lots of Choctaw slaves from Mississippi. Choctaws are among the largest group that are enslaved and are sold through South Carolina to the West Indies and to New England and held in South Carolina. There are also tribes even west of the Mississippi that get raided and are brought in as slaves. Florida is cleaned out. Firstly, all the Indians that remained in Florida after the Spanish period are cleaned out by the English and sold as slaves in South Carolina.
You say cleaned out?
Yeah, virtually depopulated. Florida is virtually depopulated of its native population. The Indian people who later live in Florida are primarily people moving south to get away from the whites. Seminoles, for example. They move south from what is now Alabama and Georgia. But the native inhabitants, by and large, are enslaved. They're Christians, they have Spanish surnames, but they're brought north here to South Carolina and become part of the slave population.
You mentioned Alabama and Georgia, these names that we now know for these places. and you probably don't know some of the names that were used for, say, what is now the southern United States or the eastern seaboard. I don't know. Would you happen to know some of the Native American names for these areas?
Well, of course, each group had its own name. Up in our area of where some of my people are from, up in the Chesapeake Bay area, we had the term Atan-Akamic.
Near Washington? Or
Powhatan, yeah, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, and all through that area. Atan-Akamic was one of the names that was used. Another one was Saint Akamak. It means, I think, our fertile earth. Akamic means a place on the earth. Down in this area, one name I'll mention too is Chicora, which is very important. South Carolina should probably change its name to Chicora, or some people would write it Shakori or Shakora. The reason for that is because the first Africans were brought to Chicora by the Spanish in the 1520s. They accompanied a Spanish expedition which was basically looking for slaves, but also intended to establish a settlement. And it so happened that the Africans rebelled, and the Spaniards left. They had some fighting with the native people in the area, and the Africans rebelled and remained behind. This was in the 1520s. So these are the first permanent non-Native American settlers in continental North America, long before St. Augustine and long before Jamestown. And that area was known as Chicora. With their father or something, they think like a Spaniard, and they're allowed to be a soldier and participate in the conquest. One of the early governors of New Mexico was married to a Mexican Indian woman, and his son later became prominent. He was a mestizo. No. Later, what happens is that a lot of these prominent mixed bloods marry Spanish women or lighter-skinned women who are brought over from Europe in a trickle, and they lighten themselves so that they become a light elite who are known as Creoles later on.
Good evening and welcome to For the People, and the second part of our conversation with Dr. Jack Forbes, author of Black Africans and Native Americans. We continue our discussion of some of the names Native Americans had for certain sections of this land.
Well, of course, each group had its own name. Up in our area of where some of my people are from, up in the Chesapeake Bay area, we had the term Atan-Akamic.
Near Washington? Or
Powhatan, yeah, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, and all through that area. Atan-Akamic was one of the names that was used. Another one was Saint Akamak. It means, I think, our fertile earth. Akamic means a place on the earth. Down in this area, one name I'll mention too is Chicora, which is very important. South Carolina should probably change its name to Chicora, or some people would write it Shakori or Shakora. The reason for that is because the first Africans were brought to Chicora by the Spanish in the 1520s. They accompanied a Spanish expedition which was basically looking for slaves, but also intended to establish a settlement. And it so happened that the Africans rebelled, and the Spaniards left. They had some fighting with the native people in the area, and the Africans rebelled and remained behind. This was in the 1520s. So these are the first permanent non-Native American settlers in continental North America, long before St. Augustine and long before Jamestown. And that area was known as Chicora at that time, which probably comes from the Shakori native people. In the coastal area of Georgia, you have a region that's known as Guale or Huale, and that could possibly be the origin of Gullah, possibly. I'm not for sure, but when white people speaking English start saying Guale, you know, it's going to change its accent a little bit there. But that is the region of coastal Georgia, and there were many tribes that lived there: the Yamasees, the Huas, and others who became ancestral to the Miccosukee people who now live down in Florida.
Okay, another quote. You quote Tartaroff, who said, quote, "The 16th century perpetrated the greatest genocide in human history. In 1500, the world population is approximately 400 million, of whom 80 million inhabit the Americas. By the middle of the 16th century, out of these 80 million, there remain 10.
Yeah. Well, that's the real Holocaust. Very comparable to the, what the Nazis did to the Jews in recent times, if not even more severe.
But you're talking from 80 million to 10 million.
That's right. Now, a lot of those people died because of new diseases that were introduced, but that doesn't really let the Spaniard off the hook. Because what the Spaniard...
Before you go to that, the diseases, what are you talking about?
Well, apparently syphilis, for example, well, some people think that syphilis originated in the Caribbean, perhaps, but I don't believe that at all for reasons that I won't go into here. But I think syphilis was brought in, but also smallpox, measles, and a number of other epidemic diseases.
Okay.
But the reason those diseases, I think, had such a disastrous effect was because the Spaniard drastically interfered with the ecology. Now, we're beginning to learn today that you can't mess with the ecology of an area. Even introducing new animals and plants can disrupt the whole thing, let alone forcing people away from their traditional villages, trying to make them eat different kinds of food or not enough food. And one of the big factors that happens to native labor and to all labor in systems of extreme oppression is that they're not fed enough. They don't get enough caloric intake. Studies of the California missions, for example, the Spanish missions in California, show that the Indian people in those missions were being underfed. They were malnourished. So it's no wonder that diseases then come along and take their toll. In addition to which, the Spaniards, in the early stages especially, were fighting a lot of battles with Indian people, and a lot of people were killed through military action. And because the Indian population was quite heavy, in central Mexico, for example, there were 20 million people. Well, it's only in this century, in recent years, that there are as many people in Mexico today, in that part of Mexico, as there were before Cortez reached Mexico in the 1520s. Some of the West Indian islands, like Haiti, there are estimates as high as 1 million or more people living on the island. Although we don't know exactly, but there were a lot of people. And so the Spaniards believed at first that they could just kill people off very rapidly. They could always go get more. And but then, of course, that proved to be disastrous. Now, I should mention that the native population has recovered, of course, somewhat in modern times. But even in the United States, for example, we still don't have as many native people as we probably did at the time that Columbus arrived.
How many are there?
Well, the census shows about 2 million people today who mark Native American on the race question, along with another 8 or so million who say they have some Indian ancestry, but they don't necessarily mark Indian on the race question. That's a very low number. There are actually more people than that. But there are only about 2 million who say, yes, I'm Indian. There are, most estimates would say at least 3 million maybe at the time of the initial European contact.
Okay. How would you describe the kind of relationship Native Americans and Africans had in Europe, Africa, and the Americas?
Europe is a story that still needs to be told. People have to take an interest, have to go to Lisbon, they have to go to Sevilla and Valencia and dig through what remain of the local records and talk to people. I've been there, and in the southern area of Portugal, for example, I ran into a lot of individuals who could recall something about Indian people being there and even looked Native American or part Native American. But generally, that basic research hasn't been done. But my impression is that the people got along pretty well from what I have seen. In the Americas, it's rather complicated because the Spaniards and the Portuguese both and the English in South Carolina particularly, and also in the Caribbean. All were colonists without many of their own people. Now, when you're building an empire, you never want to spend any more money than you have to. And so the number of troops you keep in the field and so on, you want to keep to an absolute minimum. So the more people that you can co-opt, that you can get to do work for you, the more you do that, then you don't have to have so many people of your own. And in many of these colonies, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the French, the English were always outnumbered vastly by the Indian people or by the black African people. And so one of the things that they try to do whenever they can is to use tribe against tribe and group against group. It's a systematic policy to attempt to get people to distrust each other and to fight each other. So sometimes Indians will be bribed to bring back runaway African slaves. That's a way to make a living. You know the territory, black slaves are trying to run away. All right, you can make some money going after them and bring them back. Well, of course, the African slaves, as well as the Native Americans, are always trying to resist. Throughout the whole region, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, African slaves form many free communities and free cities. And quite often it's done in collaboration with the local native people. So there are also many instances in which the groups do collaborate with each other.
Now, let me stop. You said many times Africans created free communities or free cities. Now, I have this impression that those Africans that ran away, they all ran away to the bushes, etc. But you mentioned the word cities. Did you mention that loosely or what?
No, they form fortified communities in many cases. Mm-hmm. Some of them are called palenques and some of them are called quilombos, depending on the area. Some of them are relatively small and they have to be mobile because of the military circumstances. But others become very large, like Palmares in Brazil became very, very large. I'm not an expert on that particular subject, but of course I run into it in my research frequently. And even in Mexico there were such groups. In the vicinity of Puebla in southern Mexico there was a very large band of Africans. Also in Guatemala there were runaway Africans establishing free communities and so on.
This idea of African slaves being docile and complacent and not that concerned about the care that they were getting from white. What would you say about that?
Well, I think that's a complete myth. But several things have to be said. A lot of times, you know, a system of terror was used, like a Spanish soldier in the northern frontier said, cruel war makes peace secure. That was his motto. La guerra dura hace la paz segura. Cruel war makes peace secure. That's not my philosophy, but that's the philosophy of imperialism, you see. In other words, if people try to rebel, you hit them with the bloodiest, cruelest response you can possibly make, whether it's an individual or whether it's a group. You might wipe out an entire community, kill every single person in it. You might cut off all the legs of those that you allow to survive, or one of their arms, send them around as examples to other people. Or if it's individuals, you burn them alive or cut them into all kinds of pieces or, you know, some other terrible technique. And that terrorism, you see, is designed to break the will of people to resist, because it means that even if you're a brave man or woman, it's not just your life you're dealing with. It's the life of many other, maybe innocent people or people you love who may be punished because you run away or you rebel. So that's the way terrorism works, to oversimplify. So it's a great mistake to think that people didn't try to resist or didn't want to resist even in the face of these severe dangers. And many, many communities of those kinds were established, and very often they involved mixed Indian people and African people. In some cases, such as in Suriname, which is fairly well known in the United States now, the Bush Negro communities there, The Indian people in that local area had already been exterminated by slavery or by warfare with the Dutch and others, and so there was an empty area where the African people could move into. Nonetheless, there was constant contact, so much so that the material culture is basically Native American, even though the people are, you know, African in appearance, and they've developed their own languages and various kinds of things.
Okay. The relationship Native Americans and Africans had in Africa, I don't know if you touched on that.
This is, again, something that needs to be researched, and in my book, my research, all I do is to point out, hey, here it is, the people went there, and we need to look at it. Angola, I think, would be an especially significant area because of the intimate contact with Brazil for a long, long period of time. And I would think it would be very interesting to look at Angolan, well, to talk with Angolan people today and see what they know, to look through the colonial documents, to look at the music, the folklore, and all kinds of other things, foods that people eat. But that's a subject that I haven't really gone into in great depth.
Okay. How did the white man's rule or dominion over both the Native American and African determine the tone of the two groups' interaction or relationship?
Well, there are several ways that I can answer that. I'll give you an illustration of the complexity of it. In California, which was on the northern fringes of the Spanish Empire, in the 1760s and subsequent, a number of Spanish soldiers and some settlers were sent to the north. Now, my research indicates that at least 20 or 25% of those people were of African descent, sometimes mixed, of course, with other ancestry. But that's not commonly known. These were free people. They were Spanish soldiers. They were used in the conquest of Upper California. And they, along with the others who went with them, the vast majority of whom were not white. The officers were usually white, but the soldiers themselves were often Indian or more commonly mixed bloods of one kind or another. These people had been recruited into the Spanish Empire at the lowest levels, and they were utilized to help control other populations that were lower than them on the scale of things. Okay, so what that indicates is that one thing that the Spaniards did in order to help maintain their power in their colonial system, they developed a caste system. And the word caste, of course, is somewhat ambiguous, but what I mean is basically a class system, but not based only on economics, but based upon inheritable characteristics, so that it's much less flexible than just a class system. Caste is more or less permanent. And what the Spaniards do, they introduce various terms, such as mestizo, to refer primarily in the Americas to a person who's part Indian and part European. Mulatto, to refer primarily to people who are African and American Indian. And various other terms for other degrees of mixture. Incidentally, you'll be interested to know that the group known as Zambos, which is another term, Zamboigos or Zambos, another term for black African Native American mixed bloods, they were regarded as the vilest group in the Americas.
Vilest?
Vilest, in the words of a Spaniard. The most difficult to control, rebellious, dangerous kind of people. And in any event, that's one Spaniard's opinion. But in any event, these different caste terms were developed basically to deny privileges to populations, to exclude. These are terms of exclusion. If you're an Indian, for example, you're not allowed to have a gun. You're not allowed to ride on horseback. And there are other things you are not allowed to do. For example, women who are not white are not supposed to be allowed to have pearls or other fancy jewelry. They're not to wear silk clothing and that type of thing. Many people are not allowed to be priests. They're not allowed to be in the clergy. Some are allowed more than others. mestizos, that is mixed bloods, for example, whose father is a Spaniard and who are raised by the father, are allowed privileges that mestizos who are living out in Indian communities are not allowed. Okay? So it doesn't go only just by the color of your skin exactly, although that's a heavy part, but it also goes to the extent that you've shown loyalty to the Spaniards. So many of the individuals who participate in the conquest of Peru and Chile, for example, are mixed blood sons of Spanish soldiers, but they grow up with their father or something, they think like a Spaniard, and they're allowed to be a soldier and participate in the conquest. One of the early governors of New Mexico was married to a Mexican Indian woman, and his son later became prominent. He was a mestizo. Later what happens is that a lot of these prominent mixed bloods marry Spanish women or lighter-skinned women who are brought over from Europe in a trickle, and they lighten themselves so that they become a light elite who are known as Creoles later on in the Spanish Empire. Well, in any event, a very elaborate system develops with a hierarchy. Now, in that system, the most astute oppressed people, of course, realize that the only way to deal with the Spaniards is through your community, your group, through the common cause of resistance. However, there are many other individuals who are deluded into the idea that the way to participate in the system is by accepting its rules and becoming hustlers for the Spaniards. That is, cooperating with the Spaniards and trying to move up the caste ladder by making money or gaining military rank or other kinds of ways of doing that. Now, the same thing happens, of course, in the English colonies in a slightly different way. One other example that I'll mention, the Spaniards are very good at giving staffs of office to Indian chiefs, and also sometimes subsidies in terms of annual salaries and privileges of collecting tribute from their own people in order to integrate those chiefs into the Spanish imperial colonial system. So this is all part of co-optation and control. And so you can imagine what this does to the relations between Africans and Native Americans. Nonetheless, many of the rebel groups in Mexico, for example, there's a famous rebellion in North Mexico known as the Chichimeca War. There were Africans, part Africans, out with those Indian people fighting against the Spaniards. Rebellions in Baja California, some of the leaders were people of part African descent. So, you see, people can choose, people do choose, different ways of dealing with this oppressive system.
Did they at any time, Native Americans and Africans, see their destinies as being tied?
Yes, I think there were times when they did. Of course, I think one of the best areas where this would be true would be in Haiti, especially in the rebellion, some of the early rebellions, and the Enriquillo one that I mentioned, who is still a national hero in the Dominican Republic. And it's interesting, I understand that many people in the Dominican Republic today still take pride in being descended from both Indian people and African people. They have that consciousness of that heritage. So there are many areas where this is definitely true. There are areas where people trade economically once the free African communities are established. On the other hand, there are other times when things are not so good. For example, in the wars in Jamaica between the Maroons, who are a group of people, as you know, who are, although the original runaways were Native Americans, by the time the British captured Jamaica, the runaways are more African, and they become more African with time. In the wars against the so-called Maroons, the British bring in Mosquito Indians from the coast of Nicaragua to use them as scouts and so on against the Maroons in the cockpit country. Doesn't work too well, but that's the kind of thing that happens.
What, I should ask this later, but maybe now is just as good a time as any. What do you think this manipulation on the part of Europeans should tell both Native Americans today and Africans generally, African Americans in particular, people of African descent on the different islands. What do you think this should say to us?
Well, I think that that we are very much weakened in our struggles by not seeing these relationships and not seeing the commonalities. We still operate under the illusion that you can fight one battle at a time in one place with an oppressor or an oppressive system that's really carrying on warfare in a number of places simultaneously. And if you only take them on at one spot, you might defeat them there, but if they're winning in these other places, you're still losing. And there are two areas which I think are very comparable today in many ways. One of them is South Africa, where perhaps things are getting a little more promising now, and similar places, Guatemala. In South Africa, it's the black population of African native descent who are the majority and who have been oppressed by colonists from Europe. In Guatemala, it's a Native American majority who are being oppressed by a small Spanish group at the top.
What is the nature of that oppression? What is that oppression like? How does it manifest itself today?
Well, it's a genocidal situation today. Genocide is taking place in Guatemala. It's my understanding that since about 1978, 100 to 200,000 native people have been killed, brutally murdered, whole communities slaughtered. And the primary factor is to prevent them from asserting their title to lands and their rights to organize labor unions and to get better wages as agricultural workers, and in other words, challenging the superstructure. In addition to that, there are about 1 million people who've been forced to leave their homes, many of them internally, to move into the slums of Guatemala City and other places, and large numbers to Mexico and to the United States. We have perhaps several 100,000 Guatemalan people in the United States now as refugees. And it's a system in which the native languages are not recognized as official languages. The native political structures are not recognized as political structures. The native people, by and large, cannot vote in elections, not only because the military runs the elections, but also because elections are conducted in a foreign language, Spanish, and the ballots are not available, you know, in Native American languages. And also it'd be very dangerous to vote in many cases anyway. So it's a system that that resembles South Africa in many, many ways. There are other places around the world that are similar too, but I would just use those examples. I think we'd be much stronger if we always were talking about Guatemala and South Africa at the same time, because it really is the same system that's oppressing people there and maintaining the oppression.
Okay, now let's go back into history a bit.
Right.
Culturally speaking, what did the two groups, Native Americans and Black Africans, what did the two groups gain from each other?
Well, that's a subject that is deserving of many a doctoral thesis and good book. The area of music, for instance, is one that intrigues me very much. I don't think we've even begun to explore the possible ways in which these musical traditions have influenced each other. I've looked at a number of books about the evolution of African-American music in the South. Some of them don't even have American Indian in the index. So it's as if that African-American people existed in the South for all of these 470 some odd years, and yet they didn't come in contact with Native Americans, or vice versa. The Native Americans never came in contact with them. One of the interesting things, however, if you know anything about Native American music, is that a lot of the eastern tribes, and particularly the southern ones, have a call and response type of music. There's a lead singer who sings a refrain, and then the group sings back. And it goes on like that throughout the music, and particularly stomp dance songs, they're called. And this whole kind of music is, they don't celebrate Marco Polo Day in China or Europe or Hong Kong or any place else that I know of. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because the Chinese, you know, are still in possession of their own country, and the Europeans didn't get a good foothold there. If they had, they'd probably be celebrating Marco Polo Day. So what that tells us, I think, is that Columbus Day is part of the ritual of colonialism. It's part of the ritual of imperialism.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. And the final part of our conversation with Dr. Jack Forbes, author of Black Africans and Native Americans. With the enslavement of Native Americans and Africans by Europeans came a maze of racial and caste designations. In this segment, we learned that the term Negro didn't apply just to Africans, but to Native Americans as well.
Well, the Portuguese particularly begin using the term negro or black for a wide variety of people other than people from Africa. They apply the term very commonly to the native people of India and to other areas of Southeast Asia. But when they arrive in Brazil, they also use the term for the native people of Brazil. They call the Indians of Brazil negros da terra, which means the natives of the land. And then later, when they begin bringing people over from Africa, they call them negros da Guiné, black people from Guinea. This term Negro is just used very commonly, interchangeably with Indio. So you become, I've become convinced that basically what the Portuguese meant by Negro was non-white. In other words, any group of people who were not white would be categorized that way, and that Indians, therefore, were just another kind of non-whites or Negros. The term was also used in a very similar way by English-speaking people. And not only in Britain, but also in the United States area, you find instances where people who are clearly of Native American ancestry are categorized as Negro or black. The term black is used in English interchangeably with Negro very often. A blackamoor in England. So it's a term that we have to watch out for. In 1719, for instance, the government of South Carolina decreed that all persons who were not full-blood Indians, such as musties and mulattoes, which I'll mention in a moment, would be classified as Negroes. So when we find lists of slaves during that period of time, and subsequently, of course, where it says there were so many Negroes, this does not necessarily mean pure blood Africans. It can be people of various kinds of Indian and African mixtures. Now, I mentioned a couple of words there, musty and mulatto. Mulatto is a term that developed, I think, in Spain or Portugal, probably derived from an Arabic term, either muwalad, a term meaning one who is assimilated or adopted into the Arabic community, or from the term maula, which means one who has a feudal obligation, including the obligation of parent, of child to parent. In other words, in that system, a son was considered to have a relationship of malado, as it's called in Portuguese, to the patriarch of the family. From either of those terms, or from both coming together, I think the term mulatto evolves. It's not probably originally a racial term per se, but gradually it comes to mean a person who is essentially half African and half something else. But in the West Indies particularly, we see an example after example in Spanish royal decrees and the definitions that are given by Spanish officials as well as by Native American writers. The term mulatto means primarily black and Native American. Not black and white, but black and Native American. Turning to the French colonies, we also find that the term mulat, or its equivalent in French, was used for people of American, Native American, and French ancestry, even without any African ancestry, in the Louisiana area, for instance. And the same thing is true in the British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. In Virginia in 1705, for instance, the government decrees that the child of an Indian will be known as a mulatto. That is, a person who's half white and Indian, half African and Indian, will be a mulatto legally.
Okay, let me cut you off here because we don't want to keep you here all day. The significance of this being what? What is the lesson? What is this telling us?
Well, there are several things that are significant about it. Of course, one of them is the way that colonialism tries to develop all kinds of elaborate classification terms for different kinds of people, but that's another subject. The most significant thing here is to reveal the much greater amounts of Native American ancestry that are present within the African American population than most people realize, because they might have been misled by the use of terms like mulatto, and also people of color. Colored people included Native Americans, for example, in the United States area.
But even with this classification system, you have this system, this classification system is still working in the interest of the European. Or what? Is that true or what?
Well, it's working in several ways, I think. It works to obscure the relationships between African Americans and other groups. For example, the Mexican American population has a lot of African ancestry. By and large, they don't know that, or the African American population doesn't know that. So it's very difficult to build a bridge of understanding, you see. What we are lacking in many cases is the realization that even though there are differences, even though we each have our cultures, which we want to protect and keep alive, we have our community traditions, we have different languages in some cases, but nonetheless we have also bonds of kinship. And we shouldn't forget those bonds of kinship.
Now, Dr. Francis Welsing, psychiatrist, has said that the white population on the earth is a minority population. And one of the ways that a minority population becomes a majority population, conceptually, theoretically, and practically, is to divide the majority group into little groups, so that by doing that, the minority group, in this case European, becomes the majority group. How do you see that? And does that apply here in what you're talking about?
It does apply here, although it's also very, very common in Latin America, where the Spanish elites who control a good many of the Latin American countries use mixed bloods against the Indian masses. And they try to convince the mixed bloods that they are actually white or near white, and that they're better than those who are darker. So they still use the caste system, you see, so that they can maintain themselves in power. And once in a while they share a little bit with some person who rises from that group. In the United States, the most beautiful example of that technique is the coining of the term Hispanic these days. Hispanic means Spaniard. And that term has been coined by the federal government to co-opt Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans into believing that they are more related to a white type cultural heritage, because there's no question about what Hispanic is Spaniard. And even within the federal government's definitions, white Spaniards are allowed to qualify for affirmative action and for other kinds of things under this term, Hispanic. So it has many purposes, but one of them is to, as you were suggesting, you see, bring this group closer to the white population, so that even as in California, where Hispanics may become a majority by the year 2010, they may not be an effective majority, because many of them will be co-opted into thinking that they're white.
How do you see this obsession Europeans generally have with the color of people whose skin isn't white?
Well, in my research, I've found that it was not an obsession of Europeans, at least of Mediterranean Europeans, in the period in which modern imperialism and colonialism begin.
Which is?
In the 1200s to the 1400s, 1500s. In that period of time, there was free intermarriage between Spaniards and black African women, between Portuguese and black African women, and so on and so forth. And their children were often freed and became part of the general population. I'm not saying it was a paradise, but I'm saying that there's a good indication that they were much more concerned about whether you were a Christian or not than they were concerned about the precise color of your skin or the texture of your hair or those kinds of things. Where this kind of racialism that we're talking about develops is in colonies. It is a characteristic of colonies, whether it be South Africa, whether it be the Caribbean and the Spanish Empire in the Americas, whether it be the British colonies in North America. Racialism of the kind that we're concerned about is a feature of economic exploitation and of the need to develop a hierarchy in order to control the people that are being exploited. The Europeans in Europe are less threatened by the people that they're exploiting, you see, because they're fewer in number or they're at a great distance away. But in the colonial situation, the people that are actually out there oppressing and controlling are often in a minority. And they therefore want to make sure that the rewards belong to them and not to the others. And so one finds a very conscious attempt to develop ways of controlling and oppressing. And I could show you how the laws in Virginia, for example, develop gradually. They don't develop all at once. They develop gradually in the 1690s and early 1700s against people of color.
Mm-hmm. And you say now that this attitude, racism, is now deeply ingrained within the psyche of the European. And what do you think? Is there any hope? Is there any, how do you see that?
Well, I think that racism is most ingrained in the psyche of Europeans overseas, first of all. Not just Europeans. I think we have to make that distinction.
Uh-huh.
But it has also become a part of the general world culture of all European people and even spread to other people around the world. And I think it is deeply ingrained. And it's constantly reinforced. It's constantly reinforced by things such as having shows that run on national television where there's an intellectual topic to be discussed and no one's there but white males, as if there were no Native Americans that might have some thoughts on the subject and no African Americans. Now, the only time that we get invited is when it has to do with the ghetto or it has to do with, you know, crime or drugs or, you know, the reservation. But we're not invited when it has to do with the big philosophical issues of the world, right? That's just an example, but it is perpetuated that way.
So once again, what was the motive behind the enslavement of Africans and Native Americans?
Greed. To put it in one word, greed. A secondary motive would be the life of luxury. In other words, that's one of the things that money can pay for, but it's, you know, it's interwoven with that. An old saying was that the Spaniards never came to the Americas to work. And of course, they had servants galore to do all the work for them.
So what of this? So what of this idea that the African, and I must say now, I guess the Native American was lazy or shiftless? How do you see that in view of what you're saying?
Well, I think, again, it's a total myth, but it also has to do with a form of resistance as well. In other words, if you or I are forced to work for somebody else and we're not going to get paid, how hard are we going to work? We're probably going to work only as hard as we can get by with, because we're not doing it willingly, right? And there would be exceptions, but I think that's a form of resistance.
Why is this research into the color and racial conflict that engulfed Europe, the Americas, and Africa important today? What's the lesson?
Well, I think the lesson is that while many people are trying to transcend colonialism and racialism, we've had a lot of movements for justice, civil rights, to end apartheid, and decolonization attempts, and all these kinds of things. In spite of that, In fact, I wrote a poem about this in some respects.
Let's hear it now,
no,
please.
I can't. I can't recite it, but it has to do with the third world after 30 years. And one of the things that why we have to understand this is because acquiring political independence doesn't mean that you're psychologically or economically liberated. You may have become politically liberated in the sense of the structure of government, but your mind is still possessed in many ways by the colonial system that controls you. And economically, your assets may be owned by people from the outside. So one of the things that we have to do is to understand how systems of oppression and pecking orders will be taken over by the oppressed and perpetuated even after independence, and sometimes going on.
Now say that again. Say that again.
Okay. In Spanish ex-colonies in Latin America, for example, the Spaniards have been gone since the 1820s. So here we are, almost the year 2000, almost 180 years later, and yet almost identical oppressive hierarchical systems continue to exist, ruled substantially by the same people that were running them when the Spaniards were here, right? Now, how is that maintained? It's maintained because of disinformation, because the people who are being oppressed don't know what we're talking about. They're manipulable. They can be manipulated because they don't know the history of their own oppression. And so that's, to take it into other areas, that would be one of the big reasons why we have to understand this.
What would you say to Native American and African people around the globe about their past and their future?
Well, I think that we have to realize that we all belong to the only race that exists, and that's the human race. I think we have to realize that the concept of races was developed by white racists, and that concept is not based upon going out and looking at all the people in the world. It was developed by just sitting in their studios and thinking about it and coming up with 3 races or 5 races or 6 races or whatever they wanted to come up with. And the reality of human beings out there is that we're 95 to 96% identical. We're only 2 or 3% different in terms of our characteristics. That's all that separates all the people in the entire globe. There's only one human race. And the variations that exist between us are infinite in their complexities and shading into each other. And over all these many tens of thousands of years we've existed, we've intermarried and intermixed with each other and then separated again and come back again in very complex ways. So we're all kin in one degree or another. And I think that counts. But at the same time, we have to respect each other's uniqueness as well. And that extends not only to what we call ethnic groups, but to families. We have to recognize that there may be a family who is part African, part Irish, and part Cherokee, and they might want to recognize every one of their ancestries. Another family might want to emphasize the Native American. Another might want to emphasize the African. And then we have to respect each other in those differences, while at the same time taking pride in realizing that unique heritages enrich human life. We like to have different cultural heritages because they give us different kinds of music and different kinds of foods, you know, art and so on, to make our lives richer and more beautiful.
Now, what about that European dominance there that hangs over all of this? How do you see that?
It's also the dominance of the state. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that very often it's the state, such as the French state, that wants all French people to speak Parisian French, doesn't really want people to be speaking Basque or Bretagne. And even over here, it's the state that manipulates the differences a lot. So changing the people, I think we've made good progress there in the beginnings, at least. But we also have to think about decentralizing governments so that they have less power to manipulate us as well.
How much of this history of the brutal enslavement of Native Americans do you carry with you?
Well, I suppose I carry quite a lot with me, as do a lot of Indian people, you know, carry these kinds of things, each for their own tribe as well as for Indian people in general. And it's, of course, one of the reasons why there is alcoholism among Native American people and things like that. A friend of mine was suggesting that one of the things that Indian people have never really had is a kind of a way to overcome the sorrow of conquest, the sorrow of being conquered. Of course, some people don't really want to acknowledge it. There are people that just try to, you know, pretend that it never happened. And of course, there were some native groups that were not technically conquered militarily. They were just kind of overwhelmed bureaucratically. But they tend to end up being treated the same way, even if that's the way it happened. So there's a certain element in Native American personality among many groups particularly that just never has quite been right since the tribes were shattered. And of course, for some, it's even worse things happened.
Now, when you hear about the alcoholism problem among Native Americans, you never hear this reason, this angle that you're now discussing.
No, it's popular now to say that people have a gene for alcoholism or something like that, you know. I still believe that it's that our social cultural realities have a lot to do with these kinds of problems, not just genes. But in any case, I think a lot of the alcoholism has to do with the difficulty of looking around at a world in which your people are still oppressed. For example, we can't even protect Native American burials in some places. We can't get Native American skeletal remains returned to the earth from museums and things like that. It's a start is being made. We can't protect the place names for sacred mountains. In some places, Indian people can't protect their right to pray at places of worship. The National Park Service wants to build a platform so that tourists can come in and watch Native Americans in their vision quests and that kind of thing. I mean, it's a continual battle on many fronts, you know. But that's another story.
How do you, as a Native American, feel about living in a country that once belonged to your people?
Well, I think that many Native people feel that they are the landlords, the custodians of the land, even though unrecognized. This has often been a slogan in more militant Indian movements, that we are the custodians of the country. So you have kind of a feeling that we have a responsibility to try to do everything that we can to care for this part of Mother Earth, even though we don't politically control it, even though we've been driven from traditional home areas, that in a spiritual sense it still belongs. But there's a tremendous sadness, too, at seeing things inundated and destroyed, which is a continuous process in this country, you know. It's not something that stopped some years ago. It still goes on. And you see, reservations are still, in effect, being made smaller today, primarily through the process of leasing lands to large mineral extracting corporations and other outfits that come in and tear it up for the coal that's underneath and take the water away and so on and so forth. So that it's a process that has not ended. It's still an ongoing process.
In 1992, this country plans to celebrate Columbus's so-called discovery of the New World. How do you see this planned celebration?
Well, I think one has to compare it immediately with the visit of Marco Polo to China, which, as you know, preceded Columbus's voyage by a few decades. And no one claims that Marco Polo discovered China. They don't celebrate Marco Polo Day in China or Europe or Hong Kong or any place else that I know of. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because the Chinese, you know, are still in possession of their own country, and the Europeans didn't get a good foothold there. If they had, they'd probably be celebrating Marco Polo Day. So what that tells us, I think, is that Columbus Day is part of the ritual of colonialism. It's part of the ritual of imperialism. The conquerors, as long as they're maintaining their empire, they can't be completely ashamed of what they've done. They can't completely disown it, because if they do, they have to dismantle their empire, or at least make serious moves in that direction. So I think Columbus Day is part of that celebration. Now, in a way, it is a mistake in a certain sense for Northern Europeans, who are basically of British and German ancestry, to celebrate the activity of somebody who was from the Mediterranean. But since it is the first European white penetration that they know of, they seize upon that. And they wanted to call the United States Columbia at one time. And I suppose that's where District of Columbia comes from. They didn't, so that's what D.C. gets left with, unfortunately. But the whole idea of calling a country Columbia, which some of our brothers down in Latin America do, is a gesture to the conquest, you see. It's a recognition and applauding the conquest, or the genocide.